Hi, welcome everybody. Let's get started. My name is Adrienne and I will be helping to facilitate this session today. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, which is a world-class science research institution that also plays a vital role in education. It's now within our newly established Columbia Climate School. We started our open house tradition in 1949. Doc Ewing, Lamont's first director, wanted to open up the campus for one day each year to neighbors, students, the Columbia University community, and beyond. Even now, few science facilities of LDEO's caliber and reputation open their doors to the community in this way. For over 50 years, open house has remained one of our most important events, an exciting opportunity for adults and children of all ages to learn about our planet in a fun and engaging way. It's our way of bringing Lamont science to you at home. And today, we're super lucky to be joined by Kailani Acosta, a current PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia. She's one of the scientists featured in a series of collectible cards that are also available through our LDEO to go packets. We still have limited quantities available, so if you'd like one, please sign up for them via our Eventbrite page. I'll put the link to register to receive the packet in the chat, and we'll keep mailing these out until we run out. We can only mail to the US right now, but the cards will be available for download online as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kailani and she'll share info about her with us, how she became a scientist, and what her day-to-day looks like working as a scientist. If you have any questions during the session, please use the Q&A box and we'll open it up for questions at the end. This is being recorded and it'll be posted to our YouTube channel and to the open house website after the session is over. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kailani.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much, Adrienne. Happy open house. Today, I'm going to be talking about creating diversity, equity, and inclusion in the geosciences, as well as my science trajectory and about the work that I do now. So as I said, my name is Kailani Acosta. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm originally from the South Shore of Long Island, New York. I got my undergraduate degree in environmental science at Brown University in 2016. And after I graduated, I got a job doing environmental consulting in Brooklyn to try out the world of business. I realized from that experience that what I really loved was doing research. And I decided that I wanted to go back to school and study biological oceanography because I've always been really interested in nutrients and in the ocean. In the meantime, as I was applying to PhD programs, I moved down to Miami and worked at the University of Miami as a research assistant and taught a climate change course at an anti-poverty nonprofit called Catalyst Miami. And now I'm currently a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia studying biological oceanography. And I hope to finish in 2023, so in almost 2 years. So throughout my many years of schooling, I've had the amazing opportunity to do research in incredible places. So these are some pictures from different fieldwork sites that I've done various projects and jobs in. On the left, I was working in a marsh and measuring creek beds and how they change over time. So these grasses right here are Spartina alterniflora, and you can see on the sides the mud is coming in because when plants die, their root systems die off as well, and it creates less stable creek sides. So the sides fall in. So I was measuring that for a project that I was an RU with at the Marine Biological Lab. And next, here's a contaminated brick from a remediation site that I worked on in Brooklyn when I was an environmental consultant. And then the next two photos to the right up here on the boats are from research cruises in the Gulf of Mexico in 2018 and 2019. And some other work that I've done are coral reef surveys. These bottom two left two pictures are from coral reef surveys that I did in Madagascar. And the last photo on the bottom right is from working at the Archbold Biological Station in Florida, doing work on soil microbial mutualisms. So I've told you all some things that I've done, but I haven't really gotten into how. So this is a really essential question, as well as the why, which we'll get into on the next slide. But my path into science was definitely not a straight line. I had my fair share of twists and turns. However, the through line of my life and my passions have always been science, specifically the biology and chemistry of the earth and water. I knew that I liked science in high school, and I thought that I would be a vet or a biologist or something like that. But in college, I took a class called Our Changing Planet on climate change and the anthropogenic and environmental changes currently happening throughout our planet. So I asked my professor if he had any openings in his lab, which was a terrestrial biogeochemistry lab. And to my surprise, he did. And I started working in that lab right away. And that led to me declaring my major in environmental sciences, through which I did a lot of work in both climate policy and biogeochemistry research. So that's broadly how I got interested in and started my work in the earth sciences, but I was still finding my niche and figuring out why I wanted to be a scientist. So why did I choose to become a scientist? So this is figuring out my why. Why I wanted to research and become a scientist turned out to come to me pretty easily when I tried out something that I soon learned was not for me, which was environmental consulting. So as an environmental consultant, you're hired by a company to clean up an environmental hazard or problem by first figuring out the problem, working on a remediation plan, and fixing the problem to the best of your ability. On paper, that sounds exactly like something that I would like. However, on each project, I found myself getting excited and super passionate about half of the work, which was doing the research, figuring out the problem, and understanding how extensive the problem is and what paths we need to take in order to remediate the problem. And the part that I dreaded was the lack of long-term ownership that comes with consulting on a specific project. So once you do the research, figure out the problems, figure out what you need to do, then you hand it over to a different team, and then they actually do it. So in order to figure out my path, I created a narrative of my life to connect all of the things that I liked doing and was passionate about doing and got the most joy out of in order to figure out what I should be doing with my life. And this happened to be research, specifically biological and chemical research of the ocean. So I knew that I would need to get a PhD to get a job that I really love. Additionally, as a woman of color in science, this was not lost on me that most scientists that I've ever heard of or have ever met do not look like me. In fact, in my 19 years of schooling, I've never had a teacher in a science class that was a person of color. And once I realized this, I also realized that I wanted to do something to change it, and I could do something to change it. So I'm going to be talking a bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion in science, and then I'll talk more about my biological oceanography research in the Gulf of Mexico. So an integral part of all ecosystems is diversity. Diversity leads to stronger populations, more productive communities, and better longevity. These facts are through the natural world and the human world. Diversity is necessary for success. However, this idea is not always appreciated in the same ways in our society. In science, diversity, equity, and inclusion are all the more important because scientists study and create the products that inform policy, create change, and further our understanding of the world, in an ideal world, of course. So science needs diversity, and I mean that in every sense of it. Science needs diversity in research topics, in its researchers, in its funding, in its accessibility, and in its reach. There's a big drop-off in retention of underrepresented minorities in STEM from students entering college to graduate school. There's more than a 50% drop-off in the number of students that start college and are interested in studying STEM, and those that graduate with STEM majors. And STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. And only 10% of those students that study in those fields go on to get a PhD. And as many of you know, people of color are often underrepresented in STEM fields. Minority groups make up 31% of the US population, and people from these groups are classified as underrepresented in STEM. Lack of diversity in science is a problem, especially in the geosciences. The number of underrepresented minority students in the geosciences continually decreases from the undergraduate to PhD levels. And this becomes a vicious cycle or self-fulfilling prophecy. And, you know, because there are less diverse students in STEM, there will continue to be less diverse students in STEM as you get to higher education classes. So representation is all the more important when there are few people of color in different fields, because it creates community. It's integral to achieving diversity and inclusion. So there's a lot of work to be done. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are important to so many people in all disciplines, and the importance of diversity needs to be incorporated into the structures and practices that already exist in the frameworks of our institutions. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about my research. So my research focuses on nutrients in the Gulf of Mexico, specifically nitrate and phosphate in the surface of the ocean from 1985 to 2019. So we go out on research ships like the one shown here to collect water samples and analyze the water for different biological and chemical tests to understand how nutrients vary over time and space. So what are nutrients? Nutrients are essential major elements that function as the building blocks of life and supply energy. Most people know about nutrients because we need to take in a good variety of them to stay alive. We need carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water, all of which are made up of nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which are the main ones that I'm going to focus on. We also know about nitrogen and phosphorus because they're some of the main ingredients that are in fertilizers that we put on our gardens to make our plants grow bigger and stronger. And we also learn about all of these things as components of the food pyramid. So everything in the food pyramid contains all of the nutrients that I'm interested in focusing on, like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. In the ocean, there are many similar food webs as the ones that we know on land. Phytoplankton are primary producers that consume nutrients in different forms. And then these phytoplankton are eaten by small fish and zooplankton, which are eaten by larger and larger fish, some of which are also consumed by humans. Nutrients are fundamental to the functioning of all organisms and ecosystems because they form the base of all of the food chains and food webs that we know about. Okay, so can anyone guess what this is? You can put it in the chat. What is this? Where did it come from? I'm waiting to see if anyone puts anything in the chat, but if you don't in a few seconds, then I'll just tell you. Yes, plankton, that's correct. But more generally, this is a single drop of seawater. This is magnified 25 times under a microscope, and it contains lots of different types of plankton, zooplankton, phytoplankton, larvae, bacteria, fish eggs, and worms. So if you ever take in a gulp of seawater when you're in the ocean, this is probably what you're taking in. There's a lot of stuff in there. But the kinds of things that we find in the water are influenced by the nutrients that I was telling you about in the last slide. The nutrients in these environments influence what we find in the water. So phytoplankton are the primary producers of the marine food web, and they depend on sunlight and marine nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Most phytoplankton also contain chlorophyll, which is a green pigment that is also in the leaves of trees. So satellite images can capture phytoplankton biomass in the global ocean, and we can use these measurements to understand primary production, nutrients, currents, upwelling, and human impacts. So in this map here from NASA, it shows the entire globe, and the places with lots of green means that there's high phytoplankton biomass and presumably high nutrients because they need to have adequate light and adequate food sources in order to grow. So this gives us a sense of where lots of phytoplankton are growing, where there are lots of nutrients, and how this is impacted by global currents and upwelling zones and lots of things like that. So I'm trying to understand how nutrients change over time from 1985 to 2019, and space from the coastal sections of the Gulf of Mexico to offshore sections. So this will help us better understand how the Gulf of Mexico is changing over time with human influences and with climate change. So I mentioned that I went on a research trip to do my research. So here's a little animation of where the boat went. And this is a picture of the ship that I was out on. It's called the RV Endeavor. RV stands for research vessel. And it's a research vessel that's operated by the National Science Foundation and the University of Rhode Island. In order to have ship time, scientists write grants about research that they propose to do in a specific location using a ship. And if the grant is funding, then you schedule your ship time. For my research cruise, we left from Mississippi and went out into the Gulf of Mexico and returned back at the same port in Mississippi. So we were out in the same, we were out on the same ship for a total of 3 weeks. But some research trips are many months long, depending on where you're going and what you're studying. So the Gulf of Mexico is a really interesting place to study because it's impacted by a few very strong forces. The Mississippi River Basin covers about 40% of the continental United States, and all of the water drains into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya River, which is a smaller section of the Mississippi Basin. So that's a lot of fresh water mixing with seawater in the Gulf of Mexico. And this leads to really interesting interactions between salinity, how salty the water is, nutrients, biology, and chemistry. And the other really influential force in the Gulf of Mexico is the loop current, which is shown right here. The loop current is a warm, northward flowing current that brings warm water from the Caribbean and the tropics northward into the Gulf of Mexico. And it loops around to leave the Gulf and bring water around Florida and northward where it connects to the Gulf Stream. Some of you may have heard about the Gulf Stream because it keeps our climate warm in the Northeast, and it's responsible for keeping Europe warmer than it would be otherwise. So this large, warm and fast current, the loop current, creates lots of small warm eddies because it's moving so much water so fast. So when you're moving that much water super fast, other like smaller sections of water kind of like loop off and become eddies. So these warm eddies contain lots of energy, and it's one of the reasons that there are lots of hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. As hurricanes pass over these warm areas, they convert the ocean's heat into storm energy and create stronger storm systems. So with climate change, all of these changes can produce extremely strong storms like the ones that we've been seeing. So the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers drain into the Gulf of Mexico, bringing along lots of sediments, nutrients, and fresh water. So you can see in this photo, the brown and yellowish are sediments that the Mississippi River brings out down the river. And the green is phytoplankton blooms that come from nutrients that are from the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers as well. So this section is Louisiana. New Orleans is right here. And the entire way that this Bird's Foot Delta was created was by the Mississippi River bringing lots and lots of sediments down. So if it's allowed to continue doing what it's doing for a long time into the future, it will continue building out more of this delta with sediments that it collects along the way. So the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers drain into the Gulf of Mexico and bring lots of nutrients, as I said. So this is a lot of information here, but since I'm focused on nitrogen and phosphorus, there is a lot of nitrogen and an increasing amount of phosphorus that's coming into the Gulf of Mexico. Especially in 2019, there were extremely high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus coming into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's why it's important to figure out what's happening and why it's important. So most of the nitrogen coming into the Gulf comes from agriculture, livestock, and human sources. And similarly, phosphorus comes from livestock, agriculture, and human sources. But the sources are a little bit different for each of them. So it shows that even though nitrogen and phosphorus are very important in the way that they're used together, they come from different sources and are used differently when they get to the Gulf. So we measured water samples to analyze nutrient content of the water in 2018 and 2019. And on the left is a picture of the CTD, which stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth, which is connected to a computer where you program the depths at which the CTD collects the water. So it goes down to whichever depths you tell it to, and it has lots of these bottles, like 25 of these bottles. And it closes the top and bottom latches to collect water in this 10-liter tube. So once the CTD comes back on board the ship, we collect the water in bottles and filter them onto glass fiber filters, like shown here on the right. So we collect the water into these bottles, and at the bottom of this like little V-shaped thing here is a filter. So it'll take out all of the particulates, everything that's bigger than the pore size of the filter. And then you can also collect the dissolved stuff in the water to separately compare nutrient contents in different areas and how things change with depth and with distance from shore. Okay. So since we only collected samples by ourselves in 2018 and 2019, we needed to compare these years to the past to see how nutrients have changed over time. So I compiled nutrient data from the last 34 years, from 1985 to 2019, to provide context and analyze trends to see if the big spike in what was coming out of the Mississippi River in 2019 had any difference in what was in the Gulf of Mexico over the last 34 years. So in order to understand how nutrients change spatially, I divided the samples into nearshore and offshore sections to better be able to understand what's happening near the coast and what's happening offshore. So on this map, each point corresponds to a sample location and its salinity, how salty the water is at that location and time, which lets us know how the location is influenced by the Mississippi River. And the gray points don't correspond to a salinity, so there was no salinity recorded. So here are the results of that analysis. Over the last 34 years, nitrate and phosphate concentrations in the Gulf of Mexico have changed a lot. These graphs show average nitrate and phosphate concentrations for each year, which are then averaged over rolling 3-year windows to compare trends, which is the x-axis here. These are the same x-axes. And the y-axes are the average nitrate on the top and average phosphate on the bottom. And this shows that nitrate levels stay pretty consistent over time. There is a little bit of change, but not very much that you can see. So this line shows kind of the average and how it stays pretty consistent over time. But with phosphate, the levels are much more variable, and we see that there's increasing over time. So before the 2000s, phosphate levels were quite a bit lower than they are now. So there's a significant difference in phosphate levels in the Gulf of Mexico, which is an interesting finding. And as I showed before, the loading from the Mississippi, the amount of nutrients that's coming out of the river is increasing a lot, especially in 2018 and 2019. And this graph is showing that the freshwater flow from the Mississippi River is also increasing. So the increase in phosphate and the consistency in nitrate is interesting because it's not specifically tied to what's coming out of the Mississippi River, especially not with the nitrate. So the y-axis here is the monthly mean flow in acre feet from 1980 to 2019. And this shows that the regression line is slightly increasing over time, but what's especially odd is that 2019 is the highest year of the last 35 years in terms of discharge. So we see that there have been real changes in phosphorus and in discharge in the Gulf of Mexico over time. So what does this mean for the Gulf of Mexico? Going back to the idea of nutrients as the base of the food chain, shifting this base of the food chain will impact the abundance, diversity, growth, and kinds of different life in the Gulf of Mexico. So especially phytoplankton, and therefore the things that rely on phytoplankton will change. So future work will study what else is impacted by these changes, such as the phytoplankton community, the biochemical particulate makeup of the dissolved and particulate fractions of water, and how climate change will impact the Gulf of Mexico in both the coastal and offshore regions. So that is a short summary of all of the work that I've done in terms of diversity. I didn't really get into the specifics of the different initiatives that I've started, but if you have any specific questions, let me know. Here's my contact info. Both of these emails go to the same place and my website. So yeah, let me know if you have any other questions. I think there are a few in the Q&A chat.
Yeah, we've got a few here. And a reminder, anybody, if you have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A box or in the chat. So the first question that somebody's asked is, can you share more about your career mapping? What did that look like? And did you get any inspiration for how to do it from anywhere in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when I realized that I was in a job that I didn't really see a real path forward in, I had to figure out what my real passions are and where I could see myself going from them. And because I'm a really visual person, I like to, write things down and create kind of like visual maps of what's going on in my brain. So I don't think I had like a very specific inspiration to do that, other than that's just the way that my brain works. So I kind of created a map by just like going through my resume, basically, writing down the different things that I've done, choosing what I've liked the most, like writing up basically pros and cons of everything that I've done, and basically pulling out what I think that I've been strongest at and what I've liked the most, and kind of connecting different paths from that. So when I found that, the main things that I saw in my little career map was that I studied a lot of nutrients. I liked doing research. I like teaching. It was pretty easy for me to connect all those points and say, I should probably just get a PhD and teach or work at an NGO or, for a government organization or something. But I know that I'll have more choices for myself if I connect all of these points. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. So what's your favorite part about working with other scientists?
That's a really good question. So I love the fact that there are always more questions to ask. And everyone has such a different perspective of like, what is the most interesting thing to focus on? And how can we go about this in a way that makes sense to you? So I'm a biological oceanographer, but we also work with chemical oceanographers, physical oceanographers, and they're focused on really different things. So with this work that I showed before on the Gulf of Mexico, I was really interested in what created the prime environments for these phytoplankton to grow and to like become more diverse and abundant. But physical oceanographers were like, what currents are causing, or are there any currents that are causing nutrients to flow in a certain way or to exist in this environment in this way? So I just love having a diversity of like ways of going about the same problem. And that's just really nice to be around and really interesting. Okay, I think that answered it too.
Yeah. So somebody wants to know, what is the effect of oil spills on the biodiversity of the Gulf?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So there was a huge oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, which was crazy and one of the biggest oil spills to happen in human history. And it's been an interesting place to study post 2010 because there has been a lot of research before that oil spill and after. So we've been able to see what communities are impacted by the oil spill and how things are changing over time. So right after the oil spill, we saw that there were not very many species. Lots of species were killed off because they didn't have, for phytoplankton, they didn't have as much sunlight because the oil was blocking sunlight. And it also, because oil is a big source of carbon, some bacteria and plankton species really loved it. So they went wild and they ate a lot of oil, but there's only so much oil that they could eat. But they kind of took over. So there was kind of like a monoculture of the ones that could withstand the oil and the ones that couldn't. But the interesting thing is that after the oil spill, we've seen that the community has rebounded like basically to the same levels as it was before the oil spill. So even though there was like the worst oil spill that could happen in that area, the ecosystem is super resilient and can come back from it. And biodiversity isn't, ruined forever after something like that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So we have a student in the 7th grade who is watching and wants to know, how long will it take you to get your PhD?
So it depends on what you're studying and your program that you're in. But for me, I'm hopefully going to be finished in 5 years. That's pretty much average for environmental science PhDs. Some of them are 5.5, some of them are 6. But most programs are 5 years.
And just as a follow-up, do you have any other advice for students who might be thinking about a path in earth and environmental sciences?
Yeah, I would say just to try to talk to as many people as you can. Scientists love to talk about their science. And, it's easy to just reach out and talk about things that you're excited about, that you're interested in, and to learn more and make connections. And I think that that's been the most important thing that I've done in just trying to figure out what I like and, how I could see a path for myself. And though it's scary to like reach out to people and talk about different things that you're excited about, especially if you're like scared that this person may know more than you. It's an easy way to figure out more about things that you like and, see yourself in them.
And we have a similar question, which is just if you can talk about how that kind of networking has offered you new opportunities.
I feel like most of the opportunities that I've gotten has just been through making friends with people, talking about science, talking about different things that we're passionate about. because if there's some job that someone needs done and they know that you are doing a similar work, or I'm doing like kind of a science advising job for a nonprofit where they needed someone that speaks Spanish and knows about science. And so they reached out to me and asked if I could help. And that is pretty easy to do when you're just like talking to people, making friends, and talking about your science. So networking is super important, but you don't always have to see it as like a job. You can just see it as just like being yourself and making connections and trying to broaden the scope of your science.
Shifting gears, we have a couple of different questions. One viewer wants to know, when you're out doing field work, have you found any sunken ships?
I haven't. That would be really cool. So where I was in the Gulf of Mexico is really, really deep. So even if there were sunken ships down there, I probably wouldn't see them because the depth that we were at was probably about 1,000 meters. So you can't see the ocean floor or anything near it when you're out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, because you're very, very far from the ocean floor.
And somebody has a question about when you talked about the things that we swallow in the ocean when we get a mouthful of seawater. Are those things completely dissolved, or do they stay microscopic? How does that work?
Both. So there are lots of things that are microscopic that to us would seem dissolved because you can't see them until you look at them under the microscope. But there are also dissolved nutrients and things like that that are in the water, but nothing that you swallow will really hurt you unless you see it.
And then what body of water do you find most interesting to study besides the Gulf of Mexico?
That's a good question. So I haven't studied a lot of bodies of water beyond the Gulf of Mexico, but if I could choose one to study, I think I would like to study the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, because those waters are really, really interesting. There are lots of nutrients in them. It's really cold. So the water can hold a lot more nutrients and oxygen. So the dynamics there are super different than they are in the Gulf of Mexico. And because there are not as many anthropogenic, like direct sources from humans, it would be really interesting to see how those environments are impacted by melting ice sheets and things like that.
Do you have any more research trips planned, whether to the Gulf or anywhere else?
Not right now. So since I went on 2 cruises and compiled lots and lots of data, I probably shouldn't go anywhere until I do anything with that data. So once I finish, working with the data that I have, maybe I'll go somewhere again. But for now, I will be working from home. Thanks, Dad.
What would you say is like the most fun and the least fun parts of being a scientist?
Yeah, I would say the most fun part is being able to pursue your interests. So especially now that I'm in my 4th year, I have like a big body of data of things to work with. And then I can basically just work with it and figure out what I want to do with it based on what I'm seeing. So I get to pursue my own interests. I got to learn how to code, do lots of things to like make myself a better scientist, hopefully a more well-rounded person, and be able to understand the world better in the way that I see fit. And I have access to amazing people that can help me do that. And probably the least exciting thing is that when you're on a research ship, you're measuring from a body of water that you're in, like that the ship is in. So that means you have to take lots and lots of samples and work really fast and be really good at what you're doing and not get a lot of sleep. Because if you are trying to understand what's going on in a parcel of water that you're flowing with, if you don't get all the samples that you need and you get out of that body of water, or the currents change or something, then you're sampling something completely new. So there's not as much sleep as you would like to get, which is tough, and you have to like be on it. But that's just when you're on a ship, and not everyone goes out on ships or collects data that way. Some people just work on computers and work with the data that other people collect on ships. And some people just do work in the lab. So it really depends on like what you like and how you want to do your science, because you can kind of build that for yourself.
And then once you have all of this data, how do you package and share it along with your findings?
So that leads to a long process of data analysis and figuring out how to best tell the story. So the best thing to do once you get all of the data and start analyzing it is to figure out what story you're trying to tell and how to best do it and how to best use your data to support that story. So I like the process a lot because it's more of like a creative and like pretty process than you would think happens in science. You get to make a story, write about it, and use graphs and data to support it. So hopefully that will be a paper soon, some of the work that I just showed, but yeah, it's a work in progress, figuring out what the story is, how best to tell it in a way that's impactful to the most people.
And what will you do once you get your PhD? Will you start a new study?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do. I have some time to figure it out, but I'm thinking that it would be really cool to work at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, I think, or the EPA, or something like that. I think it would be really cool to try to create policies and do science at the same time and be able to impact a lot of people and change the way that like we see and understand the ocean, and the way that we protect it going into the future.
Well, thank you. And I apologize. They've just started a bunch of construction outside my apartment as I'm trying to speak here. But thank you so much, Kailani, for this session. And thank you to everybody for attending. Please keep in touch with us, reach out to Kailani, check the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory website. We've got a whole lineup of future K-12 sessions coming up and other events, and we would love to see you there. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you again to Kailani.
Thank you.